What if Carthage won the Punic Wars Part 2? When we last left off, Mithraism had just converted most of Europe, and Islam had just made its world conquests. For this timeline to start, we need to go a little bit back before last timeline ended to deal with a topic that was too long for last timeline to deal with: how the Roman Empire changed Western civilization. A pretty blatant change to this timeline would be that without Aetius and his Roman legions who helped gather together the Germanic tribes to fight off Attila the Huns would conquer Western and Central Europe. But after the death of Attila, the Hunnic Empire would collapse, because most of the Hunnic Empire was built off Attila's skill and charisma, and with the collapse of the Hunnic Empire, the land would revert back to the previous tribes, and they would leave almost no historical record. The one exception to that rule would be that Attila the Hun would devastate the Greek states in his attack on the Balkans and Greece. In our timeline, the Byzantine Empire relied off the fertile recruiting grounds of Asia Minor to reconquer the territories in the Balkans they had lost to the Slavs and the Bulgars, but in this timeline, with the Persians controlling much of Anatolia, this recruiting ground would not exist, and thus the Slavs and the Bulgars would permanently conquer the Balkans and Greece. In our timeline, the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church it helped created a system that helped break apart the tribal distinctions within Europe, and thus this led to the formation of nations and, later on, the road to nationalism. With neither of these institutions existing, that would mean that tribes would last much longer in Europe. You'd hear much later the stories of the Frisians, Alamans, and Saxons instead of their nations. Being tribalistic doesn't automatically denote a nation to utter backwardness and savagery. Look at the Middle East and India. They've been able to build very advanced civilizations with still having tribes even today. Another important distinction between this and our timeline is that the fall of Rome gave Europe purpose. The barbarian tribes who each conquered a Roman province looked at the old territory of the Romans stretching from Britain to Syria and thought, I can do that. I can conquer that territory. And you can basically view all of European history as an attempt to try to reunify the Roman Empire, if you look at it in a certain light. Also, the European barbarians saw Roman ruins and it inspired them to build greater, to advance technologically, and to achieve more. And just as a whole, the fall of Rome gave Europe a whole new purpose. The Founding Fathers were inspired by the Roman Empire. So was the Spanish government in the 16th century, Napoleon, the British Empire, and of course the Holy Roman Empire. They were all inspired by the Roman Empire and what it had achieved earlier. Were these events purely caused by inspiration of the Roman Empire? No. It's probably only a small percentage of other events that led to these events. But it just shows the shadow of the Roman Empire and how it has changed European history in thousands of ways. Honestly, I have no idea how this Europe would turn out differently. This Europe would be different in so many thousands of little ways that it would be inaccurate for me to do any style of prediction now. Since the Phoenicians were probing around the coasts of Africa much further than the Romans were, that would mean that the Phoenicians would likely find the secret of the Cape of Good Hope long before the Europeans did in our timeline. This route would mean that technologies from the East would reach the West before they did in our timeline, meaning gunpowder and many others would reach the West earlier in this timeline. Since the Khoisan were pretty well destroyed by European diseases, and the tip of South Africa is a good waystay station in between Europe and the Indies, we can assume that the Phoenicians would have created a colony in South Africa in this timeline. Since Carthage was much more into maritime technology than the Roman Empire was, and the Carthaginians were much better sailors than the Romans, we can assume that the Americas would have been discovered hundreds of years before they were in our timeline. Since the Iberian Carthaginians likely be leaving from the same place as Columbus, they likely land in the same place as Columbus. So, the Carthaginians would likely, like the conquistadors, conquer the civilizations of the Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas. Meanwhile, the Celtic and Germanic peoples would likely colonize North America. With tribalism, and without the ghost of the Roman Empire pushing it forward, we can assume that Europe would not be as powerful as it was in our timeline. Of course, this wouldn't relegate Europe to utter backwardsness. Europe would still have a few other things going for it. Being capitalism, because you have to remember this is a world run by Carthaginians, and capitalism encourages trade, which encourages technology, as well as Europe's natural propensity for boats because of its geography, and Europe having thousands of little warring states that leads to military and technological competition because of Europe's jagged and disconnected geography. In this timeline, Europe would not be the sole powerful region like it was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It would still have to compete with the Middle East and China. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please comment or subscribe. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching.